Welcome everyone to this episode on the Iceberg Explained. Today we will be going through the serial killer's iceberg and will be covering the first part, starting with. The Moore family consisted of parents Josiah B., Sarah and their 4 children, Herman, Mary, Arthur and Paul. They were well-known and well-liked family in their community. On June 9, 1912, Mary Catherine Moore invited Ina May and Lena Gertrude Stillinger to spend the night at the Moore residence. That evening, the visiting girls and the Moore family attended the Presbyterian church where they participated in the Children's Day program, which Sarah had coordinated. After the program ended, the Moores and the Stillinger sisters walked to the Moores house. At 7 a.m. the next day, the Moores neighbor became concerned after she noticed that the family had not come out to do their morning chores. She knocked on the Moores' door. When nobody answered, she tried to open the door and discovered that it was locked. When she called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, he received no response. Upon knocking on the door and shouting, Ross unlocked the front door with his copy of the house key. While she stood on the porch, Ross went into the parlor and opened the guest bedroom door, where he found Ina and Lena Stillinger's bodies on the bed. Moore immediately told the neighbor to call Henry Hank Horton, Villisca's primary peace officer, who arrived shortly thereafter. Horton's search of the house revealed that the entire Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls had been bludgeoned to death. The murder weapon, an axe belonging to Josiah, was found in the guest room where the Stillinger sisters were found. Doctors concluded that the murders had taken place between midnight and 5 a.m. 2 spent cigarettes in the attic suggested that the killer or killers patiently waited in the attic until the Moore family and the Stillinger guests were asleep. The killer began in the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah Moore were sleeping. Josiah received more blows from the axe than any other victim. His face had been cut to such an extent that his eyes were missing. They used the blade of the axe on Josiah while using the blunt end on the rest of the victims. Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, and Paul were next bludgeoned in the head in the same manner as their parents. Afterwards, the murderer returned to the master bedroom to inflict more blows on the elder Moores, knocking over a shoe that had filled with blood, before moving downstairs to the guest bedroom and killing Ina and Lena. Investigators believed that all of the victims except for Lena Stillinger had been asleep when murdered. They thought that she was awake and tried to fight back, as she was found lying crosswise on the bed, and with a defensive wound on her arm. Lena's nightgown was pushed up to her waist and she was wearing no undergarments, leading to law enforcement speculation that the killer sexually molested her or attempted to do so. As recently as 2017, Gannon and Duarte were examining evidence going back to the late 1990s that they believe connects the deaths of 45 college-age males whose dead bodies were found in water in 11 states, often after leaving parties or bars where they had been drinking. The men, according to the former detectives, often fit a profile of being popular, athletic and successful students, and most were white. Gannon and Duarte have theorized that the young men were all murdered, either by an individual or by an organized group of killers. The term "smiley face" became connected to the alleged murders when it was made public that Gannon and Duarte had discovered graffiti depicting a smiley face near locations where they think the killer had dumped the bodies in at least a dozen of the cases. Other police forces that have investigated the deaths dispute the conclusion that the cases are linked. Police departments that are involved do not currently view the deaths associated with smiley faces present at the scenes as serial killer activity. Criminal profiler Pat Brown calls the serial killer theory ludicrous, arguing that the evidence does not fit what is known about serial killers. Brown also believes that the smiley face images found in some of the cases are likely nothing more than coincidences based upon guesses as to where the bodies entered the water, with smiley face graffiti only found after a wide area search. It's not an unusual symbol, she told Minneapolis-based newspaper City Pages. If you look in any area 5 miles square, I bet you could find a smiley face. Zodiac Killer, unidentified American serial killer who is believed to have murdered at least 5 people in Northern California, starting from 1968 when a teenage couple was shot to death near their car in a remote area north of San Francisco. 1 year later another couple was attacked in similar circumstances, though the male victim survived. After the 1969 attack, the killer phoned police to alert them to the crime and to take responsibility for the 1968 murders. Later that year, the Zodiac killer attacked another young couple, though once again the male survived. The last known victim, a taxi driver, was shot in October 1969. The murders were the subject of intense investigation and media coverage, particularly because of the killer's taunting letters to newspapers and phone calls to police. His letters were signed with a symbol resembling the crosshairs of a gun sight and typically began with the phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." Included among the letters were 4 ciphers or cryptograms, the first of which was sent in 3 parts to 3 Bay Area newspapers in July 1969, known as the 408 cipher for the number of characters it contained. It was soon decoded by a pair of private citizens. Its message stated in part that, "I like killing people because it is so much fun." Another cipher, the 340 cipher, mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle in November 1969, was finally decoded in 2020 by a team of 3 amateur code breakers. Its message began, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me." Much remains mysterious about the Zodiac case. During the 1990s, several investigators claimed to have identified the Zodiac killer. The suspect most often cited was Arthur Lee Allen, a school teacher who had been institutionalized in 1975 for child molestation, though his identification with the Zodiac killer has never been substantiated. George "Bugs" Moran was a career criminal who ran the North Side Gang in Chicago during the bootlegging era of the 1920s. He fought bitterly with Scarface Al Capone for control of smuggling and trafficking operations in the Windy City. Throughout the 1920s, both survived several attempted murders. On one notorious occasion, Moran and his associates drove 6 cars past a hotel in Cicero, Illinois, where Capone and his associates were having lunch and showered the building with more than 1,000 bullets. A $50,000 bounty on Capone's head was the final straw for the gangster. He ordered that Moran's gang be destroyed. On February 14, a delivery of bootleg whiskey was expected at Moran's headquarters. But Moran was late and happened to see police officers entering his establishment. Moran waited outside, thinking that his gunmen inside were being arrested in a raid. However, the disguised assassins were actually killing the 7 men inside. Reportedly, Frank was still alive when real officers appeared on the scene. When asked who had shot him, the mortally wounded Gussenberg kept his code of silence, responding, "No one, nobody shot me." The massacre actually proved to be the last confrontation for both Capone and Moran. Capone was jailed in 1931 and Moran lost so many important men that he could no longer control his territory. Moran was relegated to small-time robberies until he was sent to jail in 1946. He died in Leavenworth Federal Prison in 1957 of lung cancer. The Setagaya family murder refers to the unsolved murders of the Miyazawa family in Kamisoshigaya neighborhood of Setagaya, Tokyo, Japan. On the night of the 30th of December 2000, Mikio Miyazawa, his wife Yosuko, and their children Nina and Rei, were murdered during a DNA and many specific clues about their identity, but the perpetrator has never been identified. As the killer's epithet implies, the victims usually were attacked with an axe, which often belonged to the victims themselves. In most cases, a panel on a back door of a home was removed by a chisel, which along with the panel was left on the floor near the door. The intruder then attacked one or more of the residents with either an axe or straight razor. The crimes were not motivated by robbery, and the perpetrator never removed items from his victim's home. Home invasion by an unknown assailant who then remained in the family's house for several hours before disappearing. Japanese police launched a massive investigation that uncovered the killer's deeds. The majority of the Axeman's victims were Italian immigrants or Italian Americans, leading many to believe that the crimes were ethnically motivated. Many media outlets sensationalized this aspect of the crimes, even suggesting mafia involvement despite lack of evidence. Some crime analysts have suggested that the killings were related to sex, and that the murderer was perhaps a sadist specifically seeking female victims. Criminologists Colin and Damon Wilson hypothesized that the Axeman killed male victims only when they obstructed his attempts to murder women, supported by cases in which the woman of the household was murdered but not the man. A less plausible theory is that the killer committed the murders in an attempt to promote jazz music, suggested by a letter attributed to the killer in which he stated that he would spare the lives of those who played jazz in their homes. The Axeman was not caught or identified, and his crime spree stopped as mysteriously as it had started. The murderer's identity remains unknown to this day, although various possible identifications of varying plausibility have been proposed. On March 13, 1919, a letter purporting to be from the Axeman was published in newspapers, saying that he would kill again at 15 minutes past midnight on the night of March 19 but would spare the occupants of any place where a jazz band was playing. The first 3 attacks were at lovers' lanes or quiet stretches of road on the Texas side. The 4th attack occurred at an isolated farmhouse in Arkansas. That night all of New Orleans dance halls were filled to capacity, and professional and amateur bands played jazz at parties at hundreds of houses around town. There were no murders that night. The Texarkana Moonlight Murders, a term coined by the contemporary press, were a series of unsolved serial murders and other violent crimes committed in and around the Texarkana region between Arkansas and Texas in the spring of 1946. They were attributed to an alleged unidentified serial killer known as the Phantom Killer or Phantom Slayer. This hypothetical perpetrator is credited with attacking 8 people, 5 of whom were murdered, in a 10-week period. The attacks occurred at night on weekends between February 22 and May 3, targeting male-female pairs. The murders were reported nationally and internationally by several publications, and caused a state of panic in Texarkana throughout the summer. At dusk, heavily armed residents locked themselves indoors while police patrolled streets and neighborhoods. Stores sold out of guns, ammunition, locks, and many other protective devices. Some youths attempted to bait and ambush the killer. Investigations were conducted at the city, county, state, and federal level. In the course of investigations, there have been shifting opinions by officials over whether the first and fourth attacks were committed by the same perpetrator. The prime suspect in the case was U.L. Swinney, a career petty criminal who was linked to the murders primarily by statements from his wife plus additional circumstantial evidence. After Swinney's wife refused to testify against him, prosecutors decided against pursuing murder charges, though Swinney was sentenced to a long term as a habitual car thief and forger. 2 of the lead investigators believed him to be guilty. Tried, were horribly mutilated. There has been much speculation as to the identity of the killer. It has been suggested that he or she was a doctor or butcher, based on the evidence of weapons and the mutilations that occurred, which showed a knowledge of human anatomy. Many theories have been put forward suggesting individuals who might be responsible. One theory links the murders with Queen Victoria's grandson, Prince Albert Victor, also known as the Duke of Clarence, although the evidence for this is insubstantial. Violence to prostitutes was not uncommon and there were many instances of women being brutalized, but the nature of these murders strongly suggests a single perpetrator. A quarter of a mile from the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder, the words, "The Jews are not the men to be blamed for nothing," were found scrawled on a wall in chalk, and it was suggested this was written by the killer. A police officer ordered the words to be removed, fearing an anti-Semitic backlash in an area with a large. Between August and November 1888, the Whitechapel area of London was the scene of 5 brutal murders. The killer was dubbed Jack the Ripper. All the women murdered were prostitutes, and all except for one, Elizabeth's Jewish population. Jack the Ripper was never caught and he is not thought to have killed again after November 1888. In September of 1982, Mary Kellerman gave her 12-year-old daughter a painkiller when she awoke during the night complaining of a sore throat. At 7 a.m. the next morning, her daughter was found collapsed on the bathroom floor, and later pronounced dead. Adam Yanes, a postal worker in another Chicago suburb, also died unexpectedly, though originally it was thought he had suffered from a heart attack. While his family gathered to mourn their loss, his brother and sister became ill and later died. In the days that followed, 3 more unexplained deaths occurred in nearby Chicago suburbs. Investigators found that all of the victims had taken an extra-strength Tylenol hours before their death. They suspected that someone had tampered. Interstate 70 is a long east-west freeway that links several states between Baltimore, Maryland, and Cove Fort, Utah. Though, this serial killer tended to operate more specifically between Indianapolis and Wichita during the months of April and May 1992, according to the Wichita Eagle. In total, the I-70 killer is thought to have murdered 6 victims throughout their short run, using close, precise, execution-like shots to the back of the head. No one knows whether the killer was imprisoned for a different crime, died, or mysteriously went quiet, but they fell off the map as quickly as their murder spree began, a very atypical behavior among serial killers, especially since no motive has ever been attributed to his crimes besides the medication. After finding 2 more contaminated bottles, Tylenol realized the vulnerability of the product and ordered a national withdrawal of every capsule. James Lewis, the one and only suspect in the 1982 Tylenol killings, has been forced by a judge to surrender DNA samples to investigators, ABC News has learned. No one has ever been charged in the Tylenol poisonings that left 7 people dead and an entire nation paralyzed by fear. Prosecutors appeared to stop looking for the killer. Almost 20 years later, no one has been convicted of the murders. Besides the obvious desire to end lives. Many killers of this nature tend to kill until some brave soul stops them. This case differs from other serial killer cases. For one thing, there's the speed at which it went cold, with authorities running out of leads nearly from the beginning. That is, until a key piece of information was identified in 2012, revitalizing the search for the mysterious I-70 serial killer and bringing new interest to the story surrounding his murders. The upstairs lounge arson attack occurred on June 24, 1973 at a gay bar called the Upstairs Lounge located on the 2nd floor of the 3-story building at 604 Iberville Street. Remains to identify and a serial killer to catch. It took investigators a year to identify all 11 women they had unearthed. They built detailed timelines of the women's last known whereabouts, interviewed 200 women who were working the streets the same years that the victims were, and compiled suspect timelines. They executed a slew of search warrants within the investigation's first year, and focused on a few possible suspects. But none of them have ever been officially accused of the crime. Police say they continue to follow up on leads to this day, but 7 years in, the case in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the United States, 32 people died and at least 15 were injured as a result of fire or smoke inhalation. The official cause is still listed as undetermined origin. The primary suspect, a gay man with a history of psychiatric impairment named Roger Dale Nunez, who had been ejected from the bar earlier in the day, was never charged and took his own life in November 1974. No evidence has ever been found that the arson was motivated by hatred or overt homophobia. Until the 2016 Orlando nightclub shooting, in which 49 people were murdered, the Upstairs Lounge arson attack was the deadliest known attack on a gay club in U.S. history. On February 2, 2009, a woman walking her dog stumbled across a human bone, the first of many in what would become one of the largest crime scenes in American history. At first, the pace was frantic. There were human seems to have slowed. It remains unsolved. The Hinterkaifeck murders occurred on the evening of March 31, 1922, in which 6 inhabitants of a small Bavarian farmstead, located approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich, Germany, were murdered by an unknown assailant. The 6 victims were Andreas and Kazilia Gruber, their widowed daughter Victoria, Victoria's children, Kazilia and Joseph, and the maid, Maria. They were all found struck dead. And 2 men entered through an unlocked door. One pulled a .22 caliber pistol on Holguin and ordered her into the office, where she, Repass, and Hauser were already being held by the other gunman. The gunman ordered the women and children to lie down while taking approximately $4,000 to $5,000 from the bowling alley safe. Soon after, The perpetrator, or perpetrators, lived with the 6 corpses of their victims for 3 days. The murders are considered one of the most gruesome and puzzling unsolved crimes in German history. 4 of the dead bodies were stacked up in the barn, the victims having been lured into the barn one by one. Prior to the incident, the family and their previous maid reported hearing horrible sounds coming from the attic, which led to that maid quitting. The case remains unsolved to this day. The Doodler, also known as the Black Doodler, is an unidentified serial killer believed responsible for up to 16 murders and 3 assaults of men in San Francisco, California, between January 1974 and September 1975. The nickname was given due to the perpetrator's habit of sketching his victims prior to their sexual encounters and slayings by stabbing. The perpetrator met his victims at gay nightclubs, bars and restaurants. On the morning of February 10, 1990, the bowling alley's manager, 34-year-old Stephanie, was in her office preparing to open the business with her 12-year-old daughter Melissa Repass and Melissa's 13-year-old friend Amy Hauser, who were planning to supervise the alley's day care. The alley's cook, Ida, was in the kitchen when Steve Turan, the alley's 26-year-old pin mechanic, entered. As Turan had been unable to find a babysitter for his 2 daughters, 2-year-old Valerie Turan and 6-year-old Paula Holguin, he intended to drop them off at the alley's day care. Not seeing anyone in the alley, Turan entered the office and stumbled onto the crime. Their purses and money were found inside the car. It appears that Thomas may have struggled with her attacker as a clump of hair was later found at the crime scene. The gunman then shot all 7 victims multiple times at point-blank range. They then set the office on fire by igniting some papers before leaving the alley. The bowling alley fire was reported soon after. Officers responding to the call discovered that Amy Hauser, Paula Holguin, and Stephen Turan had died at the scene. Valerie Turan was rushed to a hospital, but declared dead on arrival. Repass, despite being shot 5 times, called 911 on the office phone, allowing emergency services to respond immediately and saving her life along with her mother's and Ida Holguin's. However, Stephanie died in 1999 due to complications from her injuries. Police set up 10 roadblocks surrounding Las Cruces within an hour of the shooting and carefully screened anyone leaving the city. The U.S. Customs Service, Army and Border Patrol searched the area with planes and helicopters, but no arrests were made. The Colonial Parkway murders were the slayings of at least 8 people apparently by a serial killer along the Colonial Parkway in Virginia between 1986 and 1989. During that time, 3 couples were murdered and 1 couple is missing and presumed to be dead. The first 2 known victims were Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Andowski. On October 12, 1986, their bodies were found inside Thomas' white 1980 Honda Civic at the Cheatham Annex overlook along the Colonial Parkway. Thomas was working as a stockbroker at the time of the murder. An autopsy found rope burns on their necks and wrists, signs of strangulation. Their throats had been slashed, and diesel fuel was poured over the bodies and the car, but the car failed to ignite between her fingers. Thomas was nearly decapitated. Both women were fully clothed and there was no evidence of robbery or sexual assault. David Knobling and Robin Edwards, 14, were shot to death in the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, on the south shore of the James River. Knobling's black Ford Ranger pickup truck was found at the refuge parking area next to the James River Bridge with the wipers and radio on and some articles of clothing inside. 3 days later, the 2 bodies were discovered by Knobling's father and a search party along the water's edge of the James River. Third couple students Cassandra Lee Haley and Richard Keith Call were reported missing after attending a party in the University Square area in Newport News during their first date together. Call's red 1982 Toyota Celica was found, unoccupied, at the York River overlook on the Colonial Parkway the next day with some articles of clothing inside. Their bodies have never been found, but both are presumed dead. The final couples were Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer, vanished while en route to Virginia Beach. Phelps had been dating Lauer's brother at the time they went missing. Lauer's car was soon found abandoned at the I-64 New Kent rest stop in New Kent County, and it was discovered to have been heading in the wrong direction, away from their intended Virginia Beach destination. On October 19, 1989, the skeletonized bodies of Phelps and Lauer were found in a wooded area by hunters along Interstate 64 between Williamsburg and Richmond. The hunters discovered the bodies on a logging road about a quarter of a mile from Courthouse Road, a location about a mile from the I-64 New Kent rest stop where Lauer's car was found. At least one of the badly decomposed bodies appears to have suffered knife wounds. The linking of the four crimes is circumstantial, and no suspects have ever been publicly identified. Cole's red 1982 Toyota Celica was found, unoccupied, at the York River overlook on the Colonial Parkway the next day with some articles of clothing inside. Their bodies have never been found, but both were soon found abandoned at the I-64 New Kent rest stop in New Kent County, and it was discovered to have been heading in the wrong direction, away from their intended Virginia Beach destination. On October 19, 1989, the skeletonized bodies of Phelps and Lauer were found in a wooded area by hunters along Interstate 64 between Williamsburg and Richmond. The hunters discovered the bodies on a logging road about a quarter of a mile from Courthouse Road, a location about a mile from the I-64 New Kent rest stop where Lauer's car was found. At least one of the badly decomposed bodies. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and wish to see more, click the subscribe button alongside with the notification bell. You can also like the video and comment to let us know about your thought on this case, as well as if you want us to cover any other one.